Great. If all of our speakers and panelists can come up. We have about 8 minutes for questions. Thank you so much for these really thought-provoking and interesting presentations.
Hello. Is this on? Tim Bruckner, UC Irvine. I have a question for Jennifer Doleac. I enjoyed all of the presentations, but the question is, given the response that you received, and you have some prescriptive suggestions for moving forward, I just want to make a comment. I was at Population Association of America conference. Many of people here also go to that conference. The problem is not just unique to naloxone in terms of the reaction you received. I attended several talks, supplement the SNAP program, earned income tax credit. The speakers had null to counterintuitive results in terms of the policy implementation. They were very tepid in how they conveyed those results, or they downplayed them as maybe a statistical accident. And then afterwards, I came to them and said, can you talk a little bit more? And they said, well, we're worried about a political opposition group taking these results and making a big story out of it. So therefore, we don't want to talk about it at an academic conference, right? So I guess my question is, how would you recommend population health professionals move forward a variety of missions in terms of health equity and others while being respectful of this academic discourse?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I said, this is not my usual crowd. I think economists are much more willing amongst ourselves to talk about things that don't seem to be working. I will say, in the response that we got over the course of the Twitter responses and a lot of pushback, I had a number of, especially junior researchers who are working on public health topics, reach out to me and say, they had this interesting study, they think it's important, but they're really worried now about the backlash it's going to receive, so maybe they should just stop this research and just put the paper in a file drawer and never talk about it again. And in every case, I was like, please don't do that, right? We need to, clearly, there's a cultural norm here that needs to change. We all need to be out there, be more comfortable talking about what the research is showing us, even if it's not the result we'd hoped for. That said, I will say, I'm not super eager to work in public health again. I have plenty of stuff that I can work on in criminal justice where people are, the advocates in that space are much more receptive to research, and that's really unfortunate. We need good people working on these topics, and the extent to which the nature of this discourse and the pushback to research that we don't like is dissuading people from working on important topics like this is a real problem. And so I don't have a solution, but I think it's something that has to change.
Jeff Levy from George Washington University. A comment and then a question. The comment, I think, is for Jennifer. I think this woe is me approach that you seem to be taking, I think you may have missed the first part of today where public health was saying and population health was saying how poorly we are doing. So I think there is an acknowledgement and willing to recognize that we have problems and things aren't working as we would like. I'd be curious to hear Sandro's reaction both to the HIV passing reference, which is hardly commonly accepted, but also the naloxone discussion about whether we were giving the fish naloxone, but we were ignoring the water, and therefore they died. And that may be a stronger explanation than perhaps what you were putting forward. But I'd like to turn more towards sort of the more general theme of this conference, which is about population health, and sort of suggest to Paula that we shouldn't be so negative about healthcare discovering social determinants of health. This is a good thing. We need them, we need their resources, we need their access to people, and we need their political clout to change policy. And where people are is going to be on a spectrum. And you had on your side, but didn't mention things like accountable communities for health, which truly are going upstream and trying to think about addressing the health of a community. But healthcare is part of that. And if they enter that process by thinking about population health management, and we have to work with them to get them to see a broader and broader population that they really should be thinking about, that's a good thing. And I worry about overly we don't want them to stop at where you describe them as, but I think we want to perhaps see it as a more positive step that gives us a chance to help them grow.
I knew we were going to do this, and I knew we were going to do it in public. Let me just say, I agree. You and I have been having this conversation for 3 or 4 years, and I will say that I am not the most patient person in the world. Any of my family members will tell you that. But Jeff, the giant sucking sound from population health to population health management is loud, and it's getting louder. And all the business, opportunity, the monetization and the medicalization, I see really not going in a great direction. I'm not arguing it shouldn't happen, but that's the title of my remarks was the imperative to stay upstream. Some people have to continue to stay upstream because fundamentally that's where the change is going. Otherwise, we're just working along the margin.
We just address the broader point. I thought, and maybe Jennifer can comment. I thought Professor Doleac's presentation was one of the best ones I've heard all year. Actually, I think that there's a separate forum and a separate discussion to argue about the particularities of the studies that we saw here. But I think the 2 key points that I heard, which were absolutely right, I agree with completely, is number one, that we need to have the tolerance for discussions about studies that we disagree, and we cannot quash any of those. And number 2 is, I think we do a disservice to the world when we say the world can't handle complexity. I actually think, I actually echo with sadness Professor Doleac's observation that public health as a scholarly community, that we're seeing a closing of the public health mind and we're conflating scholarship with advocacy too much. That's my take. I don't know if you want to comment.
Hi, Josh Darcy from Johns Hopkins. I'm going to pick up on that a little bit. I think certainly the idea of respectful dialogue is really important. I guess the question I have is whether when there's some people who may not be respectful, that delegitimizes, the respectful dialogue that people are trying to have around research. And I'm sure there's a great study from Boston University about naloxone, which some people might argue had a much stronger design and was peer-reviewed, that found a significant reduction in mortality. And so you have not just the fact that you do a study and then you assume that it's right and everybody who's criticizing you is, pretty much out there, and how can they be criticizing you? There's actually a real evidentiary discussion that can be had respectfully. And I think a number of people who are concerned about the naloxone paper weren't shouting slogans. They were citing peer-reviewed studies that actually had stronger designs, had designs that were thought of in advance and not just afterwards, that didn't assume that somehow people using naloxone were going to make the fentanyl appear in the drug supply. So there's a very serious academic critique there. And I just think it's important not to conflate these 2 discussions. I totally agree with both of you that it's important to have respectful dialogue, but that does not necessarily mean that the conclusions that we're talking about have validity.
Well, let me take a stab, just since it builds on my comment. I agree with everything you said, Josh, but I think we are allowing the conversation to conflate these issues. And I do think that social media and the echo chamber sort of amplifies this. This is why in my response to Professor Levy's question, I said, I don't think this is the forum for the conversation on the specifics of these studies. And yes, I know the Buse study well, it comes from my institution. So I think there is that discussion. But I think the broader point that we are seeing instances of conflating what should be a scientific discussion with what might suit an advocacy agenda well, and there's abundant cases like that in recent times. So I do think we need to be careful on this. I mean, how do we deal with it? You said, what if there are other actors outside of us who are not following those rules? I think it's a matter of values. I think given that this is an academic community, our values should be to tolerate, encourage, and really listen to discussion no matter what happens outside of us. I do realize it's not so easy, but I do think my assessment is that we as an academic community have fallen short of that ideal quite a bit recently. That's my assessment.
I don't disagree. I would just say that the way to solve that, I think, is to be aware that there is a legitimate discussion to be had about methodology and not act like it's all, just this affront that advocates take. I think I don't think that the discussion really advances a fair way of talking about it if you're not talking about the legitimate academic issues that are there in some of the research.
As researchers, Anita and I were very open to having serious academic discussions about the methodology. I mean, if you've ever been to an economics seminar, people are not nice to each other, and people will tear us apart. Like we held this paper very close to our chest for a very long time because we wanted to make sure it was completely nailed down and completely accurate before we put it out there. I think a lot of the conversation, frankly, was just a confusion about methods across disciplines. I think public health researchers and economists do things differently. We talk about methods differently. We're open. We tried very hard to have those conversations across disciplinary lines to try to get everyone on the same page. I think your read of the situation is just more generous than mine was about what people were, how strongly people let their priors influence how they were viewing the research methods.
Sorry, I think we're getting close to our time limit here, so I think we can take one more question and then need to wrap up. One quick question, please. Thank you.
That's a lot of pressure. Philip Alberti from the AAMC. Really incredible panel and discussion, and I really do appreciate kind of this academic versus academic smackdown we're here right now, but I feel like we're maybe missing the forest for the trees, and so I wonder, in service of kind of thinking about how we go upstream in policy making, it seems that there's a need for some discourse around how to develop policies in a formative evaluation way with deep community and user engagement. It seems like we often have, as a policymaker, kind of failure of imagination to anticipate unintended consequences, to think about outcomes that might be important for other stakeholders beyond the healthcare system or a policymaker, et cetera. So how can we think about avoiding... How do we think about avoiding maybe some of these pitfalls, these intense debates, by engaging communities and populations that we are aiming to work with and serve in the development of policy to really think through in a more thoughtful way what might happen 5, 10, 15 years down the road?
Awesome question, Philip. And obviously, there's lots of different ways that this needs to happen. And academics need to not be so academic in their ivory towers, and then policymakers need to do a better job, actually looking to research and what the findings are, and community needs to inform all of these endeavors. So I don't have a handy-dandy checklist. I think that'll be a good topic of conversation for everyone during break.
Let me just add one comment on it. I think correctly we have our thinking has swung to making sure that we're doing work that is responsive to contemporary needs and that involves community and voices, etc. And I think that's entirely correct. I do think that we should be honest with ourselves and recognize that there actually is such a thing as knowledge and expertise and methodological nuance and complexity that ultimately benefits from a community of experts fighting it out. And this echoes a little bit sort of the previous conversation. And I don't think it has to be a contradiction to say that there is such a thing as knowledge, there's such a thing as complexity, and we should have an academic sort of a mud fight about it, while also being responsive to and sensitive to contemporary concerns to make sure that they're community relevant, and while also making sure that our work can inform policy and can be useful for advocacy. I think these are not necessarily contradictions, but I would caution us, certainly my read, and maybe this is me slipping in optimism, is that we've been blurring these in the past decade. That's my read.
Just to respond, I would also encourage us then to acknowledge the complexity and the knowledge and the wisdom and expertise on the community side too.
Right.
Okay. All right, let's thank our panels for today. It was really interesting discussion.